Hi and welcome to The Landlord Zone and the first episode of The Landlord Zone, which is a new podcast for landlords, as you might expect, which is going to look at some of the burning issues in the sector, but also talk to some of the most experienced and interesting people who lead it. Today we have Suzanne Smith, who is going to join us in a minute, and you will get an introduction about her any moment. But also we have Paul Champlina, who is a little-known landlord who has barely ever been on television. However, I am the least known of these two, but my name is Nigel Lewis and I am the editor or head of content of Landlord Zone. So, Suzanne, tell us about yourself.
Well, I'm a small-time landlord with four properties, but before I became a landlord, I worked as a lawyer in business for 25 years. And I've been doing landlording for 5 years. And a couple of years ago, I set up a blog trying to share what I'd learned called the Independent Landlord blog. And I haven't stopped writing since.
It's a great blog.
Thank you.
I know it's doing really well. That's a fantastic content you've got in there. Yeah. But what made you do it?
Well, when I became a landlord to begin with, it's like you don't know what you don't know. And I hadn't even heard of the NRLA, and which seems surprising. But so I bought a property, or I already had one, an accidental landlord flat, and I bought another one, got tenants in there, and ticked off all the things that I thought I had to do, gas safety certificates and all that kind of thing. And I then tried to find out more information because I self-manage about all the ins and outs of things, and I found it very difficult to find reliable content because the letting agents all give you a little bit but want you to use them, and a lot of the other things it just doesn't go into any detail. And I decided to start self-letting. And
did you have the time to do that though?
Well, I wasn't working. Working at this point.
So you finished your career, so to speak, in your initial career, and then went into property.
Yeah. So I stopped working as a lawyer. I chucked it in 2019, so a little while before the pandemic. But I immediately went on to do a full-time French degree at King's College London. So I did have effectively a full-time job. And but the properties that I bought were near where I lived, and they weren't that difficult to manage. But then some different things came up, and I didn't understand the rules. And so as a lawyer, I started researching them, going to primary sources and finding things out. And then eventually I found the NRLA, and I joined. And I started doing content on Instagram. I have an account there called Indie Landlord. And I started sharing things. And then I got so many DMs from people asking me questions. I thought, well, why don't I do a blog? And a friend of mine had recently set one up. And she said, oh, it's easy. And so I thought, okay, I'll do it. And so just over 2 years later, I've got over 6,000 subscribers. I send a newsletter every week on a Friday morning. About 8:30, I write it, and it's bang up to date because it's just me doing it. And, probably full of typos, but it's what's caught my eye in the week. And inevitably, I've been talking about the Renters' Rights Bill.
I was going to say, so I suspect the Renters' Rights Bill, as it's now called, is going to be the most important thing probably we all talk about.
We've lived and breathed.
Yeah, for the next 6 months. Yeah.
I feel it's like my specialist subject because sad thing that I am, I spend time watching the committees and the committee meetings and hearing what they're saying in the House of Commons.
But if you had to, so if you're a landlord watching this,
yeah,
and you're trying to work out what is going to affect your day-to-day the most within this bill, and we've all probably got a point of view on this, but certainly what is your take on the most important thing that will change their lives, so to speak, out of the huge number of changes which are coming down the line?
Well, I think it's probably not going to change things as much as people think. And I know, Paul, you're always saying don't panic because people need homes. It's like that old BT ad, people will always need plates and people need homes. And so I think it's important for landlords not to panic and to focus on having really good properties that they look after, that they choose tenants really well. They're very, very careful choosing their tenants, and they're a good landlord, and they do repairs. And some of the details are going to change. So there won't be fixed terms anymore. For some people, that's a big issue, like the HMO landlords and student landlords.
Yeah.
But for me, I don't really mind, because I have long-term tenants, their families. And other things that will change, the way we increase rents, that's going to change. Which we can talk about if you like. There are hosts of all other things, but it's a change, but it's not as bad as some people have been making out.
If you are a good landlord, and I see most of the people watching this would count themselves as good landlords or reasonable landlords or busy landlords, if long as they are compliant and pay attention to what the law says you should do. This bill doesn't change that much. If you are someone who dips below those minimums, is it fair to say that's when you are going to have...
Absolutely. Yeah. And I know it's another thing that Paul always says, you see, I do listen to Paul, is that we have to be professional. Now,
this is the time.
Yeah. I've only got 4 properties. I'm not a big build to rent, thing. But even when I had 1 property, I was really professional. Everybody, and they're not paying me for this, everybody should become an accredited landlord with the NRLA. And that's just like the basic level.
It makes total sense. I mean, I say this in all my talks, and I was saying to you before we did this podcast, I've been, last month I did 10 or 11 talks or whatever, and I'm up and down the country. This is the time for landlords to be professional. Yeah. You're naturally professional because you're a lawyer. That's inbuilt in you, right? You've got 2.74 million landlords out there. The perception of landlording has to change, but it only changes from the individual and how you perceive yourself in that relationship to your tenants. So if we asked your 4 tenants in your 4 properties, they'd say you're a brilliant landlord, right? Because you look at the detail, you're totally compliant and whatever. But because it's such a siloed business, that's part of the problem, isn't it?
Absolutely, I agree. And my children are both renters, and they've had some appalling landlords. And I bought a property from a landlord that had tenants, and it had a failed EICR. And the gas boiler had never been serviced, that kind of thing. Really bad things. And so I hope that the bad landlords go. And I know there's going to be more admin. We're going to
such as rent increases, you were saying.
Yeah. Well, also what I was thinking about is the landlord database, and that will be more admin. But I think actually it will be good. It will be useful when it eventually gets set up, and with government.
Because with the database, we're talking really about probably a day's work to set it up. And probably a couple of hours a year just to keep it up to date.
Well, it depends how many proproperties you have.
For each property.
It might take a day.
Yeah. I'm being generous, and some people are slower.
It would take half an hour, depending on how many properties you've got.
And you're going to have the ombudsman, and we know that's going to be the housing ombudsman. And of course, there's going to be confusing for tenants, if they've got a letting agent, which one they go to. But that's another subject. But the big change is, I think, the way we increase rents. So at the moment, you can do it 3 ways. If you have a rent review clause in the tenancy agreement, you have to use that. You can do it through a Section 13 notice, which I have done, or you can do it informally, or you might issue them.
Which is how most people do it, right?
Yeah, or a lot of people just renew and do another tenancy. Now, we're not going to be able to do that because there's going to be no more fixed terms. So we're all going to have to use this Section 13 notice. And the reason why the government have done this is Section 13, as part of this, has a right of appeal for the tenant to the first tier tribunal, and that they can do that at the moment. If they don't think it's if they think it's above market rent, they can already do that. Well, what's going to change is that at the moment, the tribunal will set a rent that they think is market, and that might be above the rent proposed by the landlord. And so a lot of tenants, not that many tenants do it, are worried if they appeal it might go up. But they're changing the rules so it can only stay the same or go down.
It's about suppressing rents as well, isn't it?
Yeah. But the kicker, the real kicker is, at the moment, if somebody takes you to the tribunal, and the tribunal says your rent is X, then they have to backdate the rent payment to the date.
Retrospective,
Yeah, but in the new rule, the new rent will start the first rent payment after the tribunal comes to a decision. And given the delays already in the tribunals, and the NRLA have published some research on this, that means that the whole process, if you've got a tenant who's unhappy, then they can
It'll be
delay the rent.
backdated.
That it won't be backdated anymore. That they'll get maybe 6 months at the new rent. But for me, wearing my legal hat, I think, well, you've got to prepare for that and get evidence of what's the market rent. And then I think people appeal things when they feel aggrieved. And if you get tenants that are faced with like a rent increase of 20-30%, it makes them angry, and they're likely to.
But isn't that also gonna? And I can see a massive spike in rent repayment orders as well. Do you not think that's going to come into play under the Renters' Rights Bill?
Oh yeah, absolutely. But for the rent increases. But I think what landlords should do is not have these big hikes, even if it brings up their rent to below market value. If they just do little and often, CPIH, which is what I do, then it's just less likely to be an issue.
Someone was saying to me the best advice is to always put the rent up every year by a small amount.
Exactly.
And whatever percentage is the CPI.
But I think talk about rent increases, and I say this all the time. Historically, landlords don't put rents up. Mm-hmm. They got forced to put rents up after September 2022 with a debacle of a budget. And I have to remind landlords, because landlords have short memories, and you've been a landlord for 4 or 5 years. But the times before, we've had 0% interest rates for the best part 11, 12 years. We've been in this game a long time. But landlords forget about that. And if you think about, you've got an interest rate about 5%, that's the norm anyway. Landlords weren't used to that. But obviously fixed term mortgages come in. They were forced to put rents up, which of course the knock-on effect was to tenants, wasn't it?
So if I could ask you a question, talking of section and numbers and section, have you ever evicted anyone and had to use a Section 21?
I have used a Section 21 notice. My very first landlord property was actually an accidental landlord flat that I'd bought for work purposes, and I decided that I should sell it because the yield, and this was like the beginning of 2022.
Well, the yield was only 14% or something.
The yield. Was 3.8%.
Right, yeah.
Now that is I didn't buy it. I didn't buy it as a buy to let. But the service charge had gone up so much, so that's the yield less the service charge. And I think as landlords, as investors, we should still be looking at something to see if it still washes its face. Now it was a lovely flat. I had lovely tenants, but it wasn't making any money.
The costs go up as
I
well.
would get more money by putting money in the bank. And this was even before the interest rates went up. So what I did is I went and chatted to them 6 months beforehand and said to them, look, I'm going to sell the flat. Then I served the Section 21 notice a bit closer to the time. They asked to stay another month. And I let them stay another month, and they went. So I didn't, and they were fine. I gave them a wonderful reference and their full deposit back.
And therefore, if that same scenario had come up in a year's time when the new Renters' Rights Bill and the whole Section 21 thing comes in, would that be different? And how do you feel about that?
Well, yes, it is going to be different.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that Landlord Action are going to be very busy because it's a change. At the moment, is Section 21. You don't have to give a reason. You will have a reason.
But there's normally always a reason.
Yeah, there is normally a reason.
So in that case, you were selling up, right?
Yeah, I was selling up. So for this one, once a bill comes into effect, it's a different process, Section 8, and that is an evidence-based process. And so you need to be thinking about evidence, and you need lawyers, you need solicitors advising you, not some Tom, Dick or Harry who calls himself a specialist. So you'll need to provide evidence to the court that you're going to sell. And you won't be able to do it in the first 12 months of tenancy, which I think is fair enough.
Yeah.
You'll have to give them 4 months notice. You will then look for a purchaser. If you don't sell the property, then you can't re-let it from 12 months, I think, from the date they got. You got an order for possession when they moved out, well, whenever that date was. And so it means that if you want to sell, you have to really, really want to sell.
Are some landlords going to try it on?
Oh, I'm sure they will, but they're going to be fines, really big fines. And so it means that you shouldn't you should list the property at a price that is fair and reasonable. Because if you're putting it too high, you're not going to sell it, and then you're going to be without income for all that time. Because the government's trying to stop people, or to make it more difficult for them to sell with vacant possession. I think they would rather that people sell with tenants. So yes, and I think that if people are thinking of selling, it's going to be a lot easier with Section 21 than it will be with Section 8.
Wow, okay. So it's quite interesting because I think there's definitely one part of the bill which is all about the day-to-day, and we've talked a bit about that. Then there's the other things which are much more occasionally happen to you. So when you're selling a property, or when you're reletting it, or when you're evicting someone, which doesn't happen to many landlords too often. So what are the sort of day-to-day things, would you say? Top of my mind is discrimination, and you're not going to be able to ban people who say no unjustly to people who have pets and who also have in receipt of universal credit. But that's a sort of day-to-day thing, because you relet a property often once every couple of years, so that's going to happen to you more often. What's your view on that?
Well, I mean, I'm a pet-friendly landlord. I have pets in all of my properties. The only one that doesn't have a pet has a horse.
You must have a big house.
They rent the stables as well.
She would like a dog, but her horse takes up all her time. But so I'm a pet-friendly landlord. You do get a little bit of damage. I had some people move out recently. They didn't clean the carpets. But I just think it's nice for people to have pets.
But they stay longer, don't they?
Stay
agree.
And statistically, I can tell you with my deposits hat on. Very minimal pet damage disputes at end of tenancy. It's a bit of a red herring. Dare I say it? You don't get a lot of damage with pets. It's normally wear and tear and cleaning.
Absolutely. And the damage from the dog was really that they just didn't clean the carpets. The other dog damage, I think that their teenage kids did more. But and also discrimination. We're not going to be able to discriminate against applicants who are families. Well, obviously, if you've got a one-bedroom studio, you can say it's not suitable. I mean, but I think families are wonderful tenants. They stay a long time. They put rents in the community. They look after the property. It's I consider it to be their property. They've got a form of lease from me.
On that point, and I think this is really important. And I know Section 21's going, and it's the backup plan, and that's taken all the headlines in the Renters' Rights Bill. Is it going to, and bearing in mind you've got an average of 20 applicants looking for one property, and we've got landlords exiting, isn't it a case where landlords are going to be much more methodical with referencing? They're going to get more rent guarantee insurance in place and get more guarantors. Do you see that happening?
Absolutely. So I'm in the middle of looking for tenants at the moment because the people with the dog have moved out, and it's. Interestingly, the market's calmed down a bit. I've not got as many applicants as I had when I was looking for another property last year or this other property. So I'm not having as many applicants. It's taking me a little bit longer. I've even been... I was chatting to some letting agents yesterday, and one of them said, "Oh, we can help you." And I'm thinking, well, maybe I might use a letting agent, which would be...
Why are you quite cynical about letting agents? I get a bit of scissor. We've talked about it. Have you had a bad experience?
I had a bad experience.
Right, okay.
So I've had 2 good experiences with letting agents. I've always self-managed.
Right.
I had 2 good.
You do tenant find only.
So I did tenant find, and I had 2 good experiences. Then they had a change of personnel, and I had 2 dreadful experiences that meant me go through the complaints procedure of this very large and glossy company. And that's what made me want to start finding tenants myself.
Interesting.
And so I then used an online platform. But it was really easy a couple of years ago because tenants were falling over themselves. But I've noticed the market's slowed down. So I'm going to see if I haven't found good tenants by next week, I might actually use a letting agent to help me do the tenant find. But I'm just pragmatic. If I want good tenants, and if I'm not getting them through advertising on an online portal, then I'll use a letting agent. So I don't have anything against them. I just think that they're not all the same quality.
So I think we might have to sort of go towards wrapping it up. But before we finish, one question or a couple of questions for you. One of which is, if looking at your totality of your working life, or just life in general, you could do one thing differently, what would it be?
Wow. My husband and I bought our first property just after we got married 30 years ago. And that was a deep negative equity and everything. And
Interest
then
rates 15%.
yeah, it was.
Happy days.
We're old enough and ugly enough to remember that.
Looking back, if you look at the graph, it was the best time to buy. And so I guess my one regret is we didn't keep that first house because it would make a fantastic little rental, and it would have gone up like, I don't know, five times in 30 years, or maybe even more than that. So I guess that's my one regret.
And I think the other question was, if you were a landlord, or if you were talking to a landlord and they said, I've got 20 grand spare, I don't know what to do with it, but I want to spend it on my buy-to-let property, what would you say?
Well, 20 grand's quite a lot of money. I guess there are two things I would spend the money on. It depends on the property. One is energy efficiency upgrades. I recently spent $15,000 on one of my properties, replacing the windows. I mean, they were rotten anyway, and putting in insulation, new boiler, all that kind of thing. Because even if it doesn't come into effect in 2030, the new EPC rating rule, it's going to come into some time or another, and it makes the property easier to let. And more importantly, for our customers, it's nicer for them if they're living in a warm
And they save
property.
money on energy.
Yeah, and it's a good thing. So I would spend it on that. And on another property a couple of years ago, I didn't spend 20 grand on it, but it was still a fair amount of money. I just redid the garden because it was like an industrial wasteland of a yard. And I took everything out and brought in lots of soil, turf, and I put in a railway sleepers and a raised bed, really, really low effort garden. And 2 years later now, it looks exactly the same. And that has added another room to the house. And so when people come round, they go, and it's not a huge garden, just a terrace house. They come and they go, wow. So it's those kind of things. I think, to go around your property with a critical eye and think, if I were living here, if I were a renter, what would I value? And it's not necessarily putting in black taps or all that kind of thing.
Or a cooker or something.
It's a USP to a property.
It's what would make a difference, and that will depend on the property. So they're the two big things that I've been spending on.
I've got a question.
Go.
You know me.
Yes.
What bit of advice would you have for a new landlord coming into the market now, Suzanne?
Well, first thing is that they should subscribe to my newsletter and look at my blog.
Well, of course.
And Landlord Zone, of course.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Two of the best platforms for this sort of stuff.
I'd also say they should join the NRLA and get a proper education. Now, you hear property education and it's, all of these, whiz-bang things.
Gurus.
The gurus. I don't mean that. I just, they have the Landlord Fundamentals course, which is very reasonable. And you go through, and I did the course. I went through and I actually learned a load of things. And it's to take it seriously, because you're not selling widgets. And you always say this, Paul, you're providing a home for someone to live in, and that's the right mindset. It's you've got to be investing for the future and realize that this is special what you're doing as a landlord, and we need to be good landlords, and that involves learning how to do it properly and not nickeling and diming them and being
And I think landlords do need to invest in education, the right education. The NRLA is the best value of money out there for £85 a year. I mean, the advice line alone is brilliant. I actually decided, and I've been doing landlord education for years, that I'm going to, for 2025, I'm going to put courses on with the Landlord Investment Show. No nonsense, day events, which are CPD accredited. I think that's really important. You see some of these property investing landlords that have paid thousands to go on some of these property investing and sourcing courses and that, but no one actually talks about day-to-day property management, and that's what's missing, isn't it? Well, the NRLA do that.
Yeah, and it's why I set up my blog, because it's really detailed how-to information about all different topics that I wasn't able to find. I'm going to have a book coming out next year, a manual for landlords, Yeah, but it's exciting, and I just think that people shouldn't despair. They shouldn't panic, and that if they have a property that's not making money, fine, sell it. I did. It doesn't make you a bad person, but talk to your tenant, give them lots of notice, and just generally. But it's a business. They're not your friends. You've got to be very business and fair with them, and
tenancy of customers.
Exactly.
Without tenants, we wouldn't be here.
Yeah. And you've got to have their needs. And so I kind of think, well, what would I hope my children, the response they would get from their landlords, or or a relation? And it really is the golden rule being a landlord, I think.
That's a brilliant point to finish on. Well, thank you ever so much. So we say thank you to Suzanne. We say thank you to Paul. And my name's Nigel. See you next time.